The syringe trembled in Ms. Patricia Thompson's weathered hand as she approached the skeletal German shepherd lying motionless on the cold steel table, his once magnificent frame now reduced to protruding ribs and dull, vacant eyes that stared at nothing. The lethal injection gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of Riverside County Animal Sanctuary's euthanasia room. "Stop!" The piercing scream shattered the sterile silence like breaking glass. A small blonde girl burst through the staff-only doors, her blue eyes wild with desperation, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks as she threw herself between the needle and the dying dog. Behind her, a breathless woman in scrubs appeared, reaching frantically for the child who hadn't spoken a single word in 8 months. Something extraordinary happened next. The emaciated shepherd, who hadn't responded to anyone in weeks, slowly, painfully raised his massive head and fixed his cloudy gaze directly on the 7-year-old girl's face, recognition flickering in those fading amber eyes like a dying ember suddenly catching flame. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The chaos in the euthanasia room froze as if time itself had stopped. Sophie Mitchell, who hadn't uttered a sound since 2 solemn-faced military officers had appeared at their front door with news that shattered their world, now stood defiantly between the injection and the dying German shepherd, her small body trembling with an emotion too powerful for her 7 years. "Sophie, honey, you can't be in here," Rachel Mitchell whispered urgently, her nurse's uniform still bearing the scent of her overnight shift at Riverside General. At 32, she carried herself with the exhausted grace of a woman who had been holding her breath for 8 months, ever since Staff Sergeant David Mitchell's final mission in Afghanistan ended with a flag-draped coffin and a daughter who retreated into impenetrable silence. Behind them, Dorothy Dot Henderson looked up from her volunteer paperwork, her 78-year-old eyes immediately recognizing something the others had missed. After burying her husband, Lieutenant Colonel James Henderson, and watching 3 military working dogs pass through their home over the decades, Dot possessed an intuition about broken soldiers, both human and canine, that came from a lifetime of loving warriors who carried invisible wounds. The German shepherd on the table was Atlas, though nobody at the shelter knew his real name or history. Found 3 weeks ago wandering Interstate 215 near Camp Pendleton, severely malnourished and suffering from what appeared to be a degenerative neurological condition, he had been scheduled for euthanasia after showing no response to basic treatment. His magnificent coat, once lustrous black and tan, now hung in patches over his protruding skeleton. At 8 years old, he should have been in his prime, but whatever had happened to him had reduced this once proud warrior to a shadow. Dr. Marcus Brennan stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the entrance. The shelter director's face bore the permanent lines of a man who had made too many life-and-death decisions, each one carving deeper grooves around his gray eyes. 3 years ago, his own 8-year-old son, Marcus Jr., had been killed by an aggressive dog during a neighborhood barbecue, a tragedy that transformed Dr. Brennan from a passionate animal advocate into someone who viewed large, powerful dogs through the lens of unhealed grief. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Brennan said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of practiced authority, "this area is restricted. The animal has been scheduled for humane euthanasia due to his deteriorating condition and lack of response to treatment." But Sophie wasn't listening to the adults. Her small hand had found its way through the kennel bars to rest gently on Atlas's muzzle, and something miraculous was happening. The dog's breathing, which had been shallow and labored for days, seemed to steady. His cloudy eyes, unfocused for weeks, were now locked on her face with an intensity that made the adults step back in wonder. "He's not ready," Sophie said, her voice clear and strong after months of silence. "He's waiting for someone." The sound of Sophie's voice after 8 months of silence sent a shockwave through the small room. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes as she heard her daughter speak for the first time since the military chaplain had uttered those devastating words. "We regret to inform you that your husband made the ultimate sacrifice." "Sweetheart," Rachel whispered, dropping to her knees beside Sophie. "What did you say?" Sophie's small fingers continued to stroke Atlas's muzzle, her touch somehow bringing a spark of awareness to the dog's dulled eyes. "He's waiting for Daddy," she said simply, as if this explained everything. "But Daddy can't come anymore, so he sent me instead." Dr. Brennan stepped forward, his professional demeanor wavering slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this is emotional, but this dog has been in our care for 3 weeks. He's not eating properly, shows signs of severe neurological decline, and hasn't responded to any treatment. The kindest thing—" "Wait!" Dot Henderson interrupted, her weathered voice cutting through the tension. She had moved closer to the examination table, her experienced eyes studying Atlas with the intensity of someone who had seen this before. "Marcus, look at his ear." Dr. Brennan reluctantly approached, using his penlight to examine Atlas's left ear. His expression changed immediately. "There's a tattoo here," he said slowly. "Military identification numbers." Rachel felt her world tilt. "What kind of numbers?" "K9 Atlas, ID 7749, assigned to—" Dr. Brennan paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "101st Airborne Division." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. David's unit, David's division. Sophie seemed unsurprised by this revelation, continuing to pet Atlas as if she had known all along. The German shepherd's tail gave the faintest wag, the first voluntary movement anyone at the shelter had witnessed. "That's impossible," Rachel breathed. "David never mentioned working with a dog named Atlas." Dot Henderson pulled out her phone with surprising dexterity for her age. "Honey, I still have contacts at Camp Pendleton. My James served there for 15 years before Vietnam." Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, she had pulled up a database that made Rachel's knees weak. "K9 Atlas," Dot read aloud. "Last handler, Sergeant Jake Morrison, 101st Airborne. Status, handler KIA, Afghanistan, March 15th. She looked up at Rachel with gentle understanding. "Sweetheart, that's the same day David died." The room fell silent, except for the soft sound of Sophie humming, a lullaby David used to sing to her before bedtime. Atlas's breathing seemed to synchronize with the melody, his massive head turning slightly toward the sound. Rachel sank into a nearby chair, memories flooding back. David had mentioned Jake Morrison countless times, his best friend, his brother in arms, the guy who had saved David's life twice during their deployment. In his last video call home, David had been worried about Jake's dog, saying something about making sure the K9 would be taken care of if anything happened. "Jake Morrison," Rachel whispered. "David talked about him constantly. They were like brothers." Dr. Brennan's stern expression softened slightly, but his practical concerns remained. "Even if this dog served with your husband's unit, Mrs. Mitchell, his condition is grave. He requires extensive veterinary care that would cost thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of recovery. The shelter simply doesn't have the resources." "I'll pay for it," Dot Henderson said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made far more difficult decisions in her 78 years. "Every penny if necessary." Rachel turned to the elderly woman in shock. "Mrs. Henderson, you can't possibly—" "Child, I've been saving money for 20 years to move into one of those fancy assisted living places," Dot said with a dismissive wave. "But what's the point of living safe if you can't live right? My James always said that we don't abandon our soldiers, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. Sophie looked up from Atlas, her blue eyes bright with tears, but also with a determination that reminded Rachel painfully of David. "Mommy, we have to take him home. Daddy promised Jake he would take care of Atlas if something bad happened. I heard him say it on the computer when he didn't know I was listening." Atlas lifted his head with tremendous effort, looking directly at Rachel for the first time. In those amber eyes, clouded with illness but still holding traces of intelligence and loyalty, she saw something that made her decision inevitable. Perhaps it was imagination, but she could swear she saw David looking back at her, keeping a promise he could no longer fulfill himself. "Dr. Brennan," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to commit to, "what would we need to do to take him home?" Dr. Brennan's office felt smaller with the weight of the decision hanging in the air. The walls were lined with certificates and photographs of healthy, adopted animals, success stories that seemed to mock the gravity of Atlas's condition. Rachel sat across from the shelter director's desk, Sophie in her lap, while Dot Henderson occupied the chair beside them, her weathered hands folded with the patience of someone who had waited through many difficult conversations. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dr. Brennan began, pulling out a thick folder, "I need you to understand exactly what you're taking on. Atlas has been declining rapidly since his arrival. His blood work shows severe malnutrition, possible liver damage, and neurological symptoms that we haven't been able to diagnose with our limited resources here." He spread several papers across his desk, veterinary reports, medication schedules, and estimated treatment costs that made Rachel's stomach drop. Even with her nursing salary and David's military benefits, the numbers seemed insurmountable. The initial emergency care alone would cost more than she made in 2 months. "The immediate concerns are stabilization and diagnostic testing," Dr. Brennan continued, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal genuine concern. "He'll need IV fluids, nutritional support, blood work every 48 hours, and probably an MRI to determine the cause of his neurological decline. We're looking at a minimum of $15,000 for the first month alone." Rachel felt the familiar knot of financial anxiety tighten in her chest. Since David's death, she had been treading water financially, juggling mortgage payments, Sophie's therapy bills, and the remaining debt from her mother's cancer treatment that had drained their savings 2 years ago. The life insurance money had covered the funeral and immediate expenses, but there was nothing left for emergencies like this. "I'll cover the initial costs," Dot said firmly, reaching into her purse for her checkbook, "and whatever comes after that, we'll figure out together." "Mrs. Henderson, I can't let you—" Rachel began, but the older woman raised her hand. "Honey, I've been sitting on that money for years, afraid to spend it on anything meaningful. My James used to say that money sitting in a bank account is just paper, but money spent on love is an investment in heaven." Her voice wavered slightly. "Besides, I don't have any grandchildren to spoil. Let me spoil this old soldier instead." Dr. Brennan's expression grew more troubled. "There's something else you need to know. Even with the best care, Atlas's prognosis is uncertain. The neurological symptoms could indicate irreversible brain damage. You might be fighting for a dog who will never fully recover." Sophie, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "He just needs to remember who he is." Sometimes when people are really sad, they forget, but love helps them remember. The simple wisdom from a 7-year-old made the adults pause. Rachel looked down at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw a spark that had been missing for 8 months. Sophie's face held a purpose and determination that reminded Rachel of David when he talked about his mission to help others. "There's one more concern," Dr. Brennan said reluctantly. "German shepherds, especially military-trained ones, can be unpredictable when they're ill or in pain. If Atlas becomes aggressive during treatment, we would be legally obligated to—" "He won't," Sophie interrupted with absolute certainty. "Atlas isn't mean. He's just hurt inside, like I was hurt inside when Daddy died. But he's getting better now because he found us." As if summoned by her words, the sound of barking echoed from the medical wing. Not the weak whimper Atlas had been making, but a single, clear bark that somehow conveyed both distress and hope. Sophie slipped from Rachel's lap and ran toward the door. "Sophie, wait!" Rachel called, but she was already down the hallway. They found her back in the treatment room, kneeling beside Atlas's kennel. The German Shepherd had managed to sit up, something he hadn't done since his arrival, and was pressing his nose against the bars where Sophie's small hand waited. His tail was moving in what could only be described as a wag, weak but unmistakable. "He's saying thank you," Sophie announced. "And he's telling me about Daddy and Jake. They were best friends, and they promised to take care of each other's families if something bad happened." Dr. Brennan watched this interaction with growing amazement. In 15 years of veterinary medicine, he had rarely seen such an immediate and dramatic response from a critically ill animal. Despite his professional reservations, he couldn't deny what he was witnessing. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said slowly, "if you're determined to do this, I'll need you to sign extensive liability waivers, and Atlas will need to be transported immediately to Valley veterinary specialists for round-the-clock monitoring." Rachel nodded, understanding that this decision would change everything. Her carefully managed budget would be shattered. Her quiet life would become a series of vet visits and medication schedules, and there was no guarantee that Atlas would survive the week, let alone recover. But watching Sophie gently stroke Atlas's head while humming David's favorite song, seeing the way the dog's eyes tracked her movements with growing alertness, Rachel knew that some decisions transcended financial logic. This wasn't just about saving a dying dog. It was about honoring David's promise, giving Sophie a purpose that pulled her from her own darkness, and perhaps finding a way to heal wounds that went deeper than any medical diagnosis could reach. "Where do I sign?" Rachel asked, her voice steady with resolve. Dot Henderson smiled, pulling out her checkbook with flourish. "And where do I make out the first check? Because this old soldier is going home today, one way or another?" Atlas barked again, stronger this time, as if he understood that his fight for life had just gained 2 fierce allies who would never abandon him. The first week of Atlas's recovery unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between hope and despair. Rachel's modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street had been transformed into a makeshift veterinary hospital, with Atlas's oversized dog bed positioned in the living room where Sophie could maintain constant vigil. The German Shepherd's medication schedule dominated their refrigerator door: antibiotics every 8 hours, pain medication twice daily, nutritional supplements with meals, and a complex array of vitamins that Dr. Sarah Coleman at Valley Veterinary Specialists had prescribed. Sophie had appointed herself Atlas's primary caregiver with the seriousness of a seasoned nurse. She maintained a detailed chart written in her careful 7-year-old handwriting, marking each medication time with colored stickers and noting Atlas's water intake, appetite, and what she called his happiness level on a scale of 1 to 10. The transformation in Sophie was as remarkable as any improvement in Atlas. She chattered constantly to the dog, read him stories from her picture books, and sang the lullabies David used to sing to her before bedtime. "He's at a 7 today," Sophie announced on Thursday morning, updating her chart with a green marker. "He drank all his water and ate half his breakfast, plus he wagged his tail when I told him about school." Rachel watched this interaction while preparing for her shift at the hospital, marveling at how caring for Atlas had unlocked something vital in her daughter. The selective mutism that had held Sophie prisoner for 8 months had completely disappeared, replaced by an endless stream of conversation directed primarily at her 4-legged patient. Dot Henderson had become a fixture in their home, arriving each morning with fresh supplies and the kind of no-nonsense wisdom that only came from 7 decades of life experience. She moved through their kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had managed countless household crises, preparing special meals for Atlas, and somehow making Rachel's modest grocery budget stretch to accommodate a dog who needed to gain 30 pounds. "Honey, you can't heal a broken heart on an empty stomach," Dot said, stirring a pot of homemade chicken and rice that would become Atlas's lunch. "Same goes for broken spirits. This old boy needs comfort food, not just medicine." The financial reality of Atlas's care was staggering. The initial veterinary bills had already exceeded $8,000, and Dr. Coleman had warned that they were just beginning to understand the extent of his condition. Rachel found herself lying awake at night, calculating and recalculating their expenses, wondering how she could possibly sustain this level of care on her nursing salary, but each morning brought small miracles that made the sacrifice worthwhile. Atlas was gaining weight steadily, his coat was beginning to show patches of its former luster, and his responses to commands were becoming more consistent. Most importantly, his bond with Sophie seemed to grow stronger each day, as if they were healing each other through some mysterious process that defied medical explanation. The community response was mixed and often hostile. Margaret Whitfield, who lived 2 doors down and served as the unofficial neighborhood watch captain, had organized a petition demanding Atlas's removal from the residential area. She appeared at Rachel's door on Friday evening with a clipboard and a stern expression that reminded Rachel unpleasantly of her elementary school principal. "Mrs. Mitchell," Margaret began, her voice dripping with practiced concern, "I'm sure you understand our position. This is a family neighborhood with small children. Military dogs are trained killers, and one that's been psychologically damaged could be extremely dangerous." Rachel felt her patience evaporating. "Atlas can barely stand up for more than 10 minutes, Margaret. He's hardly a threat to anyone." "Perhaps not now," Margaret persisted, "but German Shepherds are unpredictable, especially males. Several neighbors have expressed concerns about property values, not to mention the liability issues if something were to happen." Behind Margaret, Rachel could see other neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, some nodding in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the confrontation. The sight of this impromptu tribunal judging Atlas, before they had even met him, triggered a protective fury in Rachel that surprised her with its intensity. "That dog served our country honorably," Rachel said, her voice rising despite her efforts to remain calm. "He saved American lives overseas and deserves better than to be treated like a monster based on ignorance and prejudice." The argument might have escalated further if Sophie hadn't appeared in the doorway, her small hand resting on Atlas's head as he stood weakly beside her. The German Shepherd's posture was alert but non-threatening, his intelligent eyes taking in the crowd of strangers with the measured assessment of a trained professional. "He's not scary," Sophie said simply, looking directly at Margaret Whitfield. "He's just sad because his best friend died. But he's getting better now because love makes everything better, even when it hurts really bad at first." The profound simplicity of this statement from a 7-year-old seemed to deflate some of the hostility in the crowd. Atlas, as if sensing the tension, moved slightly forward to position himself protectively beside Sophie. Not aggressively, but with the subtle body language of a guardian who understood his duty. Margaret's stern expression wavered slightly as she looked at the obviously ill dog and the small girl who spoke with such mature wisdom about pain and healing. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we'll see how things develop. But if there are any incidents—" "There won't be." Dot Henderson's voice cut through the evening air as she approached from her daily walk. At 78, she moved with the confident bearing of someone who had faced down much bigger problems than neighborhood politics. "That dog has more honor in his left paw than most people have in their whole bodies, and if anyone in this neighborhood has a problem with a war hero getting the care he deserves, they can take it up with me." The crowd began to disperse, some muttering among themselves while others looked thoughtful. As Margaret Whitfield walked away, Rachel heard her telling another neighbor, "Well, We'll just have to keep a close eye on the situation." Inside the house, Atlas settled carefully onto his bed with Sophie curled up beside him, her small hand resting on his chest as she read him a story about a brave knight and his faithful companion. The sight of them together, this damaged warrior and this healing child, reinforced Rachel's conviction that bringing Atlas home had been the right decision, regardless of the challenges ahead. Dr. Coleman called that evening with the results of Atlas's latest blood work. "The good news is that his liver function is improving significantly," she reported. "His nutritional status is also much better. However, I'm concerned about some irregularities in his neurological responses. I'd like to run additional tests next week." "What kind of irregularities?" Rachel asked, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. "His reflexes are inconsistent, and there are some cognitive responses that don't quite fit the pattern of typical malnutrition recovery. It's possible there's an underlying neurological condition that we haven't identified yet." After ending the call, Rachel found herself staring at the pile of veterinary bills on her kitchen table. Even with Dot's generous financial support, the costs were mounting beyond anything she had imagined. Her credit cards were approaching their limits, and she had already borrowed against her modest 401k to cover Sophie's therapy expenses. The sound of Sophie's laughter from the living room drew her attention. Her daughter was playing a gentle game of tug-of-war with Atlas, using a rope toy that Dot had brought. The German Shepherd's movements were still slow and careful, but there was an unmistakable playfulness in his interaction with Sophie that hadn't been there even a few days ago. "Mommy, look!" Sophie called excitedly. "Atlas remembered how to play. Dr. Coleman said that's a really good sign." Rachel joined them on the living room floor, watching as Atlas gently mouthed the rope toy, his tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm. For a moment she could glimpse the magnificent animal he had once been, confident, intelligent, and devoted to protecting those he loved. That night, as Rachel tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Mommy, what if we can't make Atlas all the way better? What if he's always going to be a little bit sick?" Rachel considered her words carefully. "Then we'll love him anyway, sweetheart. Sometimes the best kind of love isn't about fixing someone who's broken. It's about loving them exactly as they are and helping them be the best version of themselves they can be." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Like how Daddy loved us even when we were sad or scared?" "Exactly like that," Rachel whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. As she turned off the lights and headed toward her own bedroom, Rachel could hear Atlas settling into his bed downstairs with a contented sigh. Despite all the uncertainties and financial pressures ahead, she knew that they had already succeeded in the most important way. They had given this wounded warrior a family to call home, and in return, he had given Sophie a reason to engage with the world again. The battle for Atlas's life was far from over, but they were no longer fighting it alone. The first seizure hit Atlas on a Tuesday morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the Mitchell household. Rachel was in the kitchen preparing Sophie's breakfast when she heard the violent thrashing from the living room, followed by her daughter's terrified scream. She dropped the cereal bowl, milk and cornflakes scattering across the linoleum as she ran toward the sound. Atlas was convulsing on his bed, his powerful body writhing uncontrollably while foam flecked his muzzle. Sophie knelt beside him, her small hands hovering helplessly over his trembling form, tears streaming down her face as she watched her beloved companion suffering in ways she couldn't understand. "Stay back, Sophie," Rachel commanded, her nursing training kicking in as she timed the seizure on her watch. 2 minutes and 38 seconds of violent muscle contractions before Atlas's body finally went limp, his breathing ragged and labored. His eyes remained open but unfocused, staring at nothing while his chest rose and fell in irregular gasps. Rachel immediately called Dr. Coleman, her fingers shaking as she dialed the emergency number. The veterinarian's voice was grave when she answered on the second ring. "Bring him in immediately. This represents a significant deterioration. We need to determine what's causing these neurological episodes." The drive to Valley Veterinary Specialists was a nightmare of traffic lights and worried glances in the rearview mirror. Atlas lay motionless in the back seat, with his head in Sophie's lap, while she sang the lullaby David used to hum, the same melody that had comforted her through countless nightmares since her father's death. "Stay with us, Atlas," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible above the engine. "Please don't go to heaven yet. Daddy's not ready for you to come home." Dr. Coleman's expression was somber as she completed her examination. The seizure had left Atlas disoriented and weak, his responses to basic commands sluggish and inconsistent. Blood work revealed abnormalities that hadn't been present in previous tests. Elevated levels of certain enzymes that suggested his condition was deteriorating rather than improving. "I'm afraid the prognosis has changed significantly," Dr. Coleman told Rachel privately, while Sophie remained in the waiting room with Dot, who had arrived within minutes of Rachel's frantic phone call. "The seizure activity indicates possible brain damage. Even with aggressive treatment, Atlas may never fully recover his cognitive function." Rachel felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "What are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that we may be looking at a diminished quality of life. Recurrent seizures, possible paralysis, loss of basic functions. At some point, we'll need to consider whether continuing treatment is in Atlas's best interest." The words hit Rachel like physical blows. After 3 weeks of progress, after Sophie's miraculous emergence from her silent world, after Dot's generous sacrifice and the community's growing acceptance, the possibility of losing Atlas felt like a cruel cosmic joke. But the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, as Atlas rested under sedation at the veterinary clinic, a black sedan pulled into the Mitchells' driveway. 2 men in expensive suits emerged, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions of practiced sympathy that immediately set Rachel's nerves on edge. "Mrs. Mitchell?" The taller man approached with an extended hand. "I'm Marcus Webb from Novatech Pharmaceuticals. This is my associate, Dr. James Hartley. We understand you've been caring for a former military working dog." Rachel's protective instincts flared immediately. "What do you want?" "We're conducting research on neurological conditions in retired service animals," Dr. Hartley explained, his voice smooth and professional. "Atlas's case has come to our attention through veterinary networks. We'd like to offer our assistance with his treatment costs." The offer should have been a relief. The financial burden of Atlas's care was becoming unsustainable, and Rachel had already maxed out 2 credit cards just covering the emergency visit fees. But something about these men made her deeply uncomfortable. Their smiles seemed calculated, their interest in Atlas oddly intense for representatives of a pharmaceutical company. "What kind of research?" Rachel asked suspiciously. "Experimental treatments for seizure disorders," Webb replied. "We've developed some promising new medications that could significantly improve Atlas's quality of life. In exchange for allowing us to monitor his progress and collect data, we would cover all medical expenses." Sophie appeared at Rachel's elbow, having returned from the veterinary clinic with Dot. Her young face was streaked with tears, but her blue eyes held a fierce protectiveness as she studied the strangers on their porch. "They smell wrong," Sophie announced with the blunt honesty of childhood. "Atlas wouldn't like them." Dr. Hartley crouched down to Sophie's eye level, his practiced smile becoming even more artificial. "Hello there, young lady. You must be very worried about your dog. We're here to help make him better." Sophie stepped closer to Rachel, instinctively seeking protection. "He's not just my dog. He's Daddy's friend. And Daddy always said to be careful of people who promise things that sound too good to be true." Webb's smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, perhaps we could discuss this privately. These decisions are often easier for adults to evaluate objectively." That single sentence triggered something primal in Rachel's protective instincts. Any organization that wanted to separate her from her daughter during a discussion about Atlas's care was immediately suspect. "No, thank you. Sophie and I make decisions together. And right now, we're not interested in experimental treatments." "You may want to reconsider," Dr. Hartley said, his professional facade slipping slightly to reveal something colder underneath. "Atlas's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Without intervention, you'll be facing some very difficult choices soon." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Rachel felt her anger building at these strangers who presumed to know what was best for her family, at the universe that kept throwing obstacles in their path, at the cruel irony of finding David's friend only to lose him to some mysterious illness. "I think you should leave," Rachel said firmly. "If Atlas needs treatment, we'll work with his current veterinarian." Webb handed her a business card, his fingers lingering slightly too long on her hand. "Keep this, Mrs. Mitchell. When conventional treatment fails, and it will, you'll want options. We'll be in touch." As their sedan disappeared down Maple Street, Dot Henderson emerged from the house carrying a baseball bat with the casual authority of someone who had faced down much bigger threats in her 78 years. "Those men weren't here to help," Dot said flatly. "I've been around long enough to recognize predators when I see them. They want something from Atlas, and it's not his well-being." That evening brought another crisis. Dr. Coleman called with results from Atlas's latest neurological tests that defied medical explanation. "Rachel, I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Atlas's brain scans show patterns that are completely inconsistent with typical seizure disorders." "What kind of patterns?" "His neural activity suggests he's not actually losing consciousness during these episodes. It's almost as if he's deliberately suppressing his responses, like he's hiding something. Combined with some irregularities in his blood chemistry, I'm beginning to suspect that Atlas's condition might not be entirely natural." The implications of Dr. Coleman's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. If Atlas's illness wasn't naturally occurring, then someone had deliberately caused his suffering. The thought that anyone could intentionally harm a service animal, a hero who had risked his life for others, filled Rachel with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. Late that night, unable to sleep, Rachel found herself going through David's military papers stored in their bedroom closet. She had avoided touching these documents since his death, but now she searched desperately for any mention of Jake Morrison or Canine Atlas. Hidden in a folder marked "Personal," she found a letter that made her blood run cold. David's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death, detailed concerns about unauthorized medical experiments being conducted on military working dogs by private contractors. He mentioned Atlas specifically, noting that Jake had become increasingly worried about his partner's health after participating in what was described as routine vaccinations. The letter ended with a chilling observation. "If anything happens to me, someone needs to find Atlas and get him away from these people. Jake was right to be suspicious. There's something very wrong here." Rachel sank onto her bedroom floor, David's letter trembling in her hands as the pieces of a horrifying puzzle began to fall into place. Atlas hadn't wandered onto Interstate 215 by accident. He had been running from something. His mysterious illness wasn't natural deterioration. It was the result of deliberate poisoning. And Novatech's sudden interest in helping with his treatment was actually an attempt to reclaim their test subject. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Mitchell, your dog belongs to us. Continuing to interfere with our research will have consequences. Return him voluntarily, and your family won't be harmed." Rachel's hands shook as she forwarded the message to Dr. Coleman and then called 911. As she waited for the police to arrive, she checked on Sophie, who was sleeping peacefully with Atlas's collar clutched in her small fist, a talisman against the nightmares that had recently returned. The battle for Atlas's life had become something far more sinister than a fight against illness. They were now at war with people who viewed a decorated war hero as nothing more than laboratory equipment, and Rachel realized that everything she loved was now in danger. The second seizure came at 3:17 a.m. on a rain-soaked Wednesday, more violent than the first, lasting 4 agonizing minutes that felt like hours. Rachel found Atlas convulsing in the hallway outside Sophie's bedroom, his powerful body thrashing against the hardwood floor with such force that picture frames rattled on the walls. This time, Sophie didn't scream. She simply collapsed beside him, her small hands hovering over his trembling form, while tears fell silently onto his matted fur. "He's dying, isn't he?" Sophie whispered as the seizure finally subsided, leaving Atlas motionless and barely breathing. Her voice carried the terrible wisdom of a child who had already learned too much about loss. Rachel couldn't find words to answer. She wrapped her arms around her daughter while calling Dr. Coleman's emergency line, watching Atlas's shallow breathing and knowing with growing certainty that they were running out of time. The veterinarian's voice was heavy with defeat when she answered, "Bring him in immediately, but Rachel—" Dr. Coleman paused, and in that silence lay everything Rachel feared to hear. "I think we need to discuss quality of life issues. This level of neurological deterioration, he's suffering, and it's only going to get worse." The drive to the emergency clinic was a funeral procession. Atlas lay motionless in the back seat, his breathing so shallow that Rachel kept checking the rearview mirror to make sure his chest was still rising. Sophie sat beside him, singing David's lullaby in a voice broken by tears, her small hand resting on his ribs where she could feel each labored breath. Dot Henderson met them at the clinic, her weathered face etched with the kind of grief that comes from watching too many good souls suffer. She had lived through the deaths of 3 military working dogs over the decades, and Rachel could see in her eyes that she recognized the signs of an ending. Dr. Coleman's examination confirmed their worst fears. Atlas's neurological responses were almost non-existent, his reflexes sluggish, his awareness flickering in and out like a candle guttering in the wind. Blood work revealed toxin levels that defied explanation, compounds that shouldn't exist in any living creature, yet somehow coursed through Atlas's system like poison designed to destroy him slowly from within. "I need to tell you something," Dr. Coleman said quietly, drawing Rachel aside while Sophie remained with Atlas. "I sent his blood samples to a specialist at UC Davis. What we found—" "Rachel, these aren't naturally occurring toxins. Someone has been systematically poisoning Atlas with experimental compounds." The words hit Rachel like physical blows. The threatening text message, David's letter about unauthorized experiments, Novatech's suspicious interest, it all crystallized into a horrifying truth. Atlas wasn't dying from some mysterious illness. He was being murdered. "How long does he have?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hours, maybe less. The toxins have caused massive organ damage. Even if we could identify the specific compounds and develop antidotes, the neurological damage appears irreversible." Dr. Coleman's professional composure cracked slightly. "I'm sorry, Rachel. I think it's time to consider letting him go peacefully." In the treatment room, Sophie had climbed onto the examination table beside Atlas, her small body curved protectively around his massive frame. She was whispering secrets into his ear, stories about David, promises about heaven, apologies for not being able to save him the way he had saved so many others. "Atlas, remember when Daddy told me about Jake?" Sophie's voice was barely audible. "He said Jake was the bravest soldier ever, and that you were brave too because you tried to save him. But maybe Maybe it's okay to stop being brave now. Maybe it's okay to rest. Atlas's eyes opened slightly at the sound of her voice, those amber depths, clouded with pain but still holding traces of recognition. His tail moved once, barely a twitch, but enough to show that he heard her, that he understood. Rachel felt her heart breaking in ways she hadn't thought possible since David's death. After everything they had sacrificed, after Sophie's miraculous recovery from her selective mutism, after Dot's generous love and the community's growing acceptance, Atlas was slipping away from them. The cruelty of it felt cosmic in scope, as if the universe itself had conspired to teach them that hope was just another form of suffering. The decision that faced them was unbearable. They could continue fighting, pumping Atlas full of medications that might prolong his life but couldn't restore his health, watching him suffer while draining their savings and their emotional reserves. Or they could let him go gently, sparing him further pain while destroying the one thing that had brought Sophie back to life. Dot Henderson entered the room carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had made similar decisions before. "Honey," she said to Rachel, "sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give someone permission to stop fighting." "But Sophie," Rachel began, looking at her daughter, who was still whispering to Atlas, her small face streaked with tears but somehow peaceful. "Sophie understands more than you think," Dot said gently. "Children often see things more clearly than adults because they haven't learned to complicate love with fear." As if summoned by their conversation, Sophie looked up from Atlas with eyes that seemed far too wise for 7 years. "Mommy, I think Atlas wants to tell us something, but he's too tired to bark anymore." She pressed her ear to his chest, listening intently for several moments before sitting up with sudden alertness. "He's not ready yet. There's something he needs to do first. Something important." Rachel was about to dismiss this as the desperate hope of a heartbroken child when Atlas suddenly lifted his head with tremendous effort, his clouded eyes focused on the treatment room door with an intensity that made everyone turn to look. Standing in the doorway was a figure none of them had expected to see. Dr. Marcus Brennan stood there, still wearing his pajamas under a hastily thrown-on coat, his usually composed face ravaged by an emotion Rachel couldn't identify. In his hands he carried a manila folder that seemed to weigh more than its physical contents could possibly justify. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Dr. Brennan said, his voice hoarse. "But there's something you need to know about Atlas's condition, something I should have told you weeks ago." He approached the examination table where Atlas lay, and the German Shepherd's response was immediate and startling. Despite his weakness, Atlas attempted to rise, his professional military bearing asserting itself even in extremis. His tail began to wag, not the feeble movement they had seen before, but a strong, purposeful motion that spoke of recognition and perhaps even approval. "Atlas knows you," Sophie observed with the direct honesty of childhood. "He's been waiting for you to come." Dr. Brennan's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down his face as he reached out to stroke Atlas's head. "I've been such a fool," he whispered. "Such a coward. I let my own pain blind me to what was happening right under my nose." He opened the manila folder, revealing documents that made Dr. Coleman gasp in recognition. Medical records, chemical analyses, correspondence between Novatech and various animal shelters, evidence of a systematic poisoning program that had affected dozens of military working dogs across multiple states. "Atlas wasn't the only one," Dr. Brennan said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth he had hidden for months. "Novatech has been conducting unauthorized experiments on retired service animals, using shelters as cover for their research. I found out 3 weeks ago, but I was too afraid to act, too afraid of the legal consequences, of losing my license, of facing more pain after losing Marcus Jr." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Atlas hadn't been randomly selected for abuse. He had been specifically targeted because of his military background, his genetic profile, his value as an experimental subject, and Dr. Brennan, who had seemed like an obstacle to Atlas's recovery, had actually been protecting him while wrestling with his own moral awakening. "There's more," Dr. Brennan continued, his voice steady now with the relief of confession. "I have evidence of antidotes, compounds that can neutralize the toxins in Atlas's system. Novatech developed them as part of their research protocol, but they've been withholding them to maintain control over their test subjects." Hope blazed in Rachel's chest like a struck match, bright and sudden and almost painful in its intensity. "Are you saying Atlas can be saved?" "I'm saying he was never supposed to die," Dr. Brennan replied. "They wanted him weak and dependent, not dead. But when you rescued him, when you gave him a family again, they decided he was too much of a liability to let live." Atlas seemed to understand that salvation was at hand. His breathing strengthened, his eyes cleared slightly, and he managed to lift his head enough to look directly at Sophie. In that gaze was everything Rachel had hoped to see: intelligence, recognition, and most importantly, the will to fight. The battle for Atlas's life was about to enter its final phase, but for the first time since this nightmare began, they had weapons to fight back. The antidote arrived by courier at 4:30 a.m., delivered by a nervous graduate student from UC Davis who had driven through the night after Dr. Brennan's frantic phone calls to veterinary toxicology experts across California. The clear liquid in the unmarked vial looked unremarkable, but it represented the culmination of months of underground research by veterinarians who had begun to suspect that something sinister was happening to military working dogs in their care. Dr. Coleman held the vial up to the light, her experienced hands steady, despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. "This is completely experimental," she warned Rachel. "We're essentially flying blind here. The compound could save Atlas, or it could kill him within minutes." Rachel looked at her daughter, who sat beside Atlas's motionless form with the quiet dignity of someone who had already said her goodbyes. Sophie's small hand rested on the German Shepherd's chest, feeling each labored breath while humming David's lullaby under her breath. The sight of this broken child loving this broken warrior with such fierce devotion made Rachel's decision inevitable. "Do it," Rachel said simply. "Atlas is a soldier. He wouldn't want to surrender without a fight." The injection process was agonizing in its simplicity. Dr. Coleman found a vein in Atlas's front leg, inserted the needle with practiced precision, and slowly pushed the plunger while they all held their breath. For 30 seconds nothing happened. Atlas remained motionless, his breathing shallow and irregular, his eyes unfocused. Then something extraordinary began to occur. Color returned to his gums first, the gray pallor of near death giving way to healthy pink. His breathing deepened and steadied. Most remarkably, his eyes cleared, not just physically, but with an alertness that had been absent for weeks. It was as if someone had switched on a light that had been dimmed to almost nothing. "Atlas?" Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with hope. "Can you hear me?" The German Shepherd's response was immediate and devastating in its emotional impact. He lifted his massive head and looked directly at Sophie, his tail beginning to wag with strength they hadn't seen since his arrival at the shelter. But more than that, he whined, a soft, questioning sound that seemed to ask where he had been and how long he had been away. Dr. Brennan watched this transformation with tears streaming down his face. "I should have acted sooner," he said, his voice broken with regret. "I knew what Novatech was doing, but I was too scared, too damaged by my own loss to do what was right." As Atlas continued to improve with each passing hour, Dr. Brennan revealed the full scope of Novatech's operation. They had been systematically targeting retired military working dogs, using their connections with animal shelters to identify and acquire animals with specific genetic profiles. The experiments were designed to test drugs that would create enhanced working dogs, animals with suppressed fear responses and heightened aggression that could be controlled through chemical manipulation. Atlas was particularly valuable to them because of his exemplary service record and his genetic markers, Dr. Brennan explained. But when he was rescued and began to recover emotionally through his bond with Sophie, they decided he was too much of a risk. A healthy Atlas could expose their entire operation. The evidence Dr. Brennan had collected was overwhelming. Financial records showing payments to shelter directors, chemical analyses of the experimental compounds, and most damning of all, video recordings of the experiments being conducted on helpless animals. It painted a picture of systematic cruelty that extended far beyond Atlas's case. But even as Atlas grew stronger, new dangers emerged. Novatech executives, realizing that their cover had been blown, began taking desperate measures to protect their operation. The threatening text messages to Rachel escalated to phone calls, then to suspicious vehicles parked outside their house. When Dot Henderson's car tires were slashed while she was visiting, it became clear that the pharmaceutical company was prepared to use violence to reclaim what they considered their property. The FBI became involved when Dr. Brennan presented his evidence to Agent Sarah Martinez, a federal investigator who specialized in corporate crimes against animals. Agent Martinez had been building a case against Novatech for months, following reports from veterinarians across multiple states who had noticed unusual patterns in military dog illnesses. Dr. Brennan's evidence gives us what we need to move forward, Agent Martinez told Rachel during a meeting at the veterinary clinic. But we need Atlas alive and healthy to serve as proof of what these compounds can do to a living creature. His recovery is literally the key to shutting down this operation. The weight of this responsibility was staggering. Atlas wasn't just fighting for his own life anymore. He was the star witness in a case that could save hundreds of other animals from similar torture. The pressure on Rachel and Sophie to keep him safe and healthy felt enormous, especially as Novatech's desperation grew more apparent. 3 days after receiving the antidote, Atlas was strong enough to walk around the block with Sophie. His gait still slightly unsteady, but his spirit clearly restored. Neighbors who had been suspicious or hostile just weeks earlier now stopped to pet him and praise his recovery. Margaret Whitfield, the same woman who had organized the petition against him, brought homemade dog treats and apologized for her earlier prejudice. "I never understood what he had been through," Margaret said, kneeling to let Atlas sniff her offered hand. "When I think about what those people did to a war hero, it makes me ashamed of how I treated him." But the most remarkable transformation was in Sophie herself. Caring for Atlas during his recovery had unlocked something profound in the 7-year-old. She spoke with confidence about veterinary procedures, demonstrated an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that amazed the professionals, and showed a maturity that seemed both heartbreaking and inspiring. "I want to be a veterinarian when I grow up," Sophie announced one evening as she helped Rachel prepare Atlas's medication. "So I can help other animals who get hurt by bad people." "That's a wonderful goal, sweetheart," Rachel replied, watching her daughter measure out pills with the precision of a trained technician. "Daddy would be so proud of how you've taken care of Atlas." "I think Daddy sent Atlas to teach me how to be brave," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Like how Atlas taught Jake and Jake taught Daddy. It's like a circle of brave people helping each other." The wisdom in this observation took Rachel's breath away. Her daughter had found a way to make sense of tragedy that eluded most adults, creating meaning from suffering in a way that honored both David's memory and Atlas's service. As Atlas's physical health improved, his true personality began to emerge. He was gentle and patient with Sophie, protective but not aggressive with strangers, and remarkably intelligent in ways that went beyond basic training. He seemed to understand the significance of his recovery, carrying himself with the dignity of someone who knew he had important work to do. The breakthrough came when Atlas led Sophie to a specific spot in their backyard, pawing at the ground with insistent determination. When Rachel and Dot investigated, they found a waterproof container buried 18 inches down, containing documents that David had hidden before his final deployment. Inside were detailed notes about Jake Morrison's concerns about unauthorized medical experiments, photographs of injection sites on various military working dogs, and most importantly, a list of other animals who had been subjected to similar treatment. David had been building his own case against Novatech, gathering evidence that he planned to present to military authorities upon his return from Afghanistan. He knew, Rachel whispered, reading through David's meticulous documentation. He knew exactly what they were doing, and he was trying to stop it. Atlas sat beside the excavated container, his intelligent eyes moving between the documents and Sophie's face. It was clear that he had been searching for this evidence, that his mysterious behavior over the past weeks had been attempts to fulfill David's mission, even while fighting for his own life. The discovery of David's evidence gave the FBI everything they needed to move against Novatech. Combined with Dr. Brennan's insider information and Atlas's living testimony to their crimes, the case became airtight. Arrest warrants were issued for 12 corporate executives, and raids were conducted on research facilities in 6 states. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus Webb and Dr. James Hartley, the men who had threatened Rachel's family, were arrested in their corporate offices while attempting to destroy evidence. The image of these formerly powerful executives being led away in handcuffs made national news, with Atlas's story serving as the centerpiece of reporting on corporate animal abuse. Sophie watched the news coverage with Atlas lying beside her, his head resting in her lap while she gently stroked his ears. "Look, Atlas," she said, pointing at the television. "The bad people can't hurt anyone else now. You did it. You saved all the other dogs." Atlas's tail wagged slowly, and he lifted his head to look at the screen where his own photograph was being displayed alongside headlines about justice and corporate accountability. For the first time since his ordeal began, he looked truly at peace. Not just healthy, but complete. The battle was over, but the healing was just beginning. 6 months after Atlas's recovery, the Mitchell family stood on the steps of the Congressional Medal of Honor Society building in Washington, D.C., surrounded by a crowd of military families, veterans, and animal rights advocates who had gathered to witness an unprecedented ceremony. Atlas, now weighing a healthy 75 pounds with his coat restored to its former lustrous black and tan, sat at perfect attention beside Sophie, who wore her best blue dress and held his ceremonial leash with the solemnity of someone far older than her 8 years. The transformation in all of them was remarkable. Rachel had used the settlement money from the Novatech lawsuit to open the Mitchell-Henderson Veterinary Clinic, specializing in military working dog rehabilitation. The clinic, co-founded with Dot Henderson, had already treated over 200 retired service animals, becoming a model for compassionate care that other communities were beginning to replicate across the country. Dot herself had moved into the apartment above the clinic, finally finding the family she had been seeking in her later years. At 79, she had become the clinic's head administrator and Sophie's unofficial grandmother, bringing decades of military family wisdom to their expanding operation. Her house sale had funded not just Atlas's recovery, but the foundation of an organization that was changing how America treated its 4-legged veterans. "Ladies and gentlemen," the ceremony's host announced, "please welcome Congressman James Fletcher to present the Congressional Gold Medal for Distinguished Service to Canine Atlas." The applause was thunderous as Congressman Fletcher, himself a veteran who had served with military working dogs in Iraq, approached the podium. Atlas remained perfectly still, his professional training evident in his posture and attention, but his eyes never left Sophie's face. The bond between them had deepened beyond anything Rachel could have imagined. They seemed to communicate without words, understanding each other's needs and emotions with an almost supernatural connection. Today, we honor not just an extraordinary animal, but the power of love to heal wounds that medicine alone cannot reach, Congressman Fletcher began. Canine Atlas served our nation with distinction in Afghanistan, saving countless lives through his courage and dedication. But his greatest service may have been teaching a grieving family that hope can survive even the darkest circumstances. As the congressman spoke, Rachel found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The financial struggles that had once seemed insurmountable were now memories, replaced by the security that came from turning their trauma into purpose. The settlement from Novatech, combined with donations from supporters around the world who had followed Atlas's story, had provided resources beyond anything they had dreamed possible. But more importantly, they had discovered that healing could become a legacy. David's evidence, combined with Atlas's survival, had led to the conviction of 15 Novatech executives and the passage of federal legislation protecting military working dogs from experimental abuse. The David Mitchell Memorial Act now required full disclosure and consent for any medical procedures on retired service animals, ensuring that no other dog would suffer as Atlas had. Sophie stepped forward when called, her small hand steady as she accepted the medal on Atlas's behalf. The 8-year-old who had once been trapped in selective mutism now spoke with confidence to the assembled crowd, her voice clear and strong as it carried across the ceremonial space. "Atlas taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Sophie said, her words carefully prepared but delivered with genuine emotion. "It means you do the right thing, even when it's really hard. My daddy was brave like that, and Jake was brave like that, and Atlas is brave like that too. They all protected people who couldn't protect themselves." She paused, looking down at Atlas, who gazed back at her with what could only be described as pride. Sometimes bad things happen to good people and good dogs, but sometimes good people find each other and make the bad things better. Atlas found us, and we found him, and now we're a family forever. The simplicity and wisdom of her words brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Rachel watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement, seeing in her not just recovery from trauma, but growth into someone who could transform pain into purpose. Dr. Marcus Brennan, who had become both a close family friend and Atlas's unofficial godfather, stepped forward to offer his own remarks. His transformation over the past months had been as dramatic as anyone's. From a man paralyzed by grief and guilt, to someone who had found redemption through courage and truth-telling. "Atlas saved my life as much as I helped save his," Dr. Brennan said, his voice steady with conviction. "When I watched him fight against impossible odds, when I saw the love that this family showed him despite their own struggles, I remembered who I used to be before grief made me afraid. Atlas reminded me that veterinary medicine isn't just about treating symptoms, it's about healing spirits." The Riverside County Animal Sanctuary, under Dr. Brennan's reformed leadership, had become a national model for ethical animal care. The facility that had once been on the verge of becoming a front for corporate experimentation was now a beacon of hope for abandoned and abused animals, with a waiting list of volunteers who wanted to be part of something meaningful. Margaret Whitfield, the former neighborhood opposition leader who had organized the petition against Atlas, now served as the clinic's head of community outreach. Her transformation from fearful critic to passionate advocate demonstrated how Atlas's story had changed hearts throughout their community. "I was so wrong about this magnificent animal," Margaret told a reporter covering the ceremony. "I let my fear override my humanity. Atlas taught all of us that military service animals aren't weapons. They're heroes who deserve our respect and care when their fighting days are over. The ceremony concluded with a moment that would be remembered by everyone present. As Congressman Fletcher placed the medal around Atlas's neck, the German Shepherd did something unexpected. He stood, walked to the memorial wall behind the podium where the names of fallen service members were inscribed, and placed his paw against the section containing David's name and Jake Morrison's name side by side on the polished stone. The symbolism was unmistakable and deeply moving. Atlas was honoring his fallen comrades, completing a circle of service and sacrifice that connected the past to the present. In that moment, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something sacred, the final fulfillment of promises made between soldiers who had loved each other enough to die for one another. That evening, the family returned to their hotel room where Atlas immediately claimed his favorite spot on the floor beside Sophie's bed. As Rachel tucked her daughter in, Sophie asked the question that had been weighing on her mind throughout the day's events. "Mommy, do you think Daddy and Jake know about today? Do you think they're proud of Atlas?" Rachel considered her words carefully, looking at the medal that now hung from Atlas's collar, catching the light from the bedside lamp. "I think they know, sweetheart, and I think they're proud of all of us, of how we took care of Atlas, of how we helped other animals, of how we turned our sadness into something good." Sophie nodded solemnly, then brightened with a thought that was pure childhood optimism. When Atlas gets really old and goes to heaven, he'll see Daddy and Jake again, and he can tell them about everything we did together, about the clinic and all the dogs we helped, and how we became a real family. The simplicity of this hope, the way Sophie had created meaning from loss and found joy in the promise of eventual reunion, reminded Rachel that healing wasn't about forgetting pain. It was about transforming it into love. Atlas had taught them all that lesson, not through words, but through his own journey from near death to renewed purpose. As the lights dimmed and Sophie drifted off to sleep, Atlas moved closer to her bed, positioning himself where he could watch over her throughout the night. His vigilance was no longer born of military training alone, but of love, the kind of protective devotion that creates families from the fragments of broken lives. Rachel sat in the chair beside the window, looking out at the nation's capital where decisions were made that affected millions of lives. Tomorrow, they would fly home to California, back to their clinic and their community and their daily work of healing wounded animals. But tonight, she allowed herself to savor this moment of complete peace, when justice had been served and love had triumphed, and the future stretched ahead filled with possibility. Atlas had found his forever home, and in doing so, he had helped them all find themselves again. The battle was over, but the love would continue forever, rippling outward to touch lives they would never know, healing wounds they would never see, creating hope in places where despair had once reigned supreme. In the end, perhaps that was what heroism really meant, not just the courage to fight when fighting was necessary, but the wisdom to love when love was the only weapon that could truly win the war. Dear friends, if you've reached this age where life has taught you that love often comes wrapped in loss, Atlas's story speaks directly to your heart. Like so many of us who've buried spouses, watched children struggle, or wondered if our best years are behind us, Rachel and Sophie discovered something profound. Sometimes our greatest purpose emerges from our deepest pain. At 78, Dot Henderson could have retreated into the safety of routine, but instead she chose to invest her life savings into love, proving that it's never too late to become someone's hero. This story reminds us that the wisdom we've gained through decades of joy and heartbreak isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be shared with those who need it most. Just as Atlas found new purpose after his service ended, we too can discover that our later chapters might hold our most meaningful contributions. Whether it's volunteering at a shelter, mentoring a struggling family, or simply choosing love over fear when faced with life's uncertainties, we have the power to create miracles in ordinary moments. Your experience, your time, your compassion, these aren't diminishing assets. They're treasures waiting to change lives. What moment in your life taught you that love is worth any sacrifice? Have you ever found unexpected purpose when you thought your best days were over? Please share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.